Hi, Dustin, can you hear me? I think you're muted or something.
Is my mic working now?
Yep, I can hear you now. Great.
Oh, your voice is sounding choppy now. That seems to always happen with Zoom, though. I don't usually use this software. So thanks for inviting me.
No problem. We are really interested in the K-Rail project. So can you give us like a quick introduction, and if you have something you can share the desktop?
Sure. So a little introduction to myself first. I'm a infrastructure security engineer at Cruise Automation. Our company is trying to build an autonomous vehicle, and they're currently driving around San Francisco. I work closely with our platform as a service team and try to do what I can to give users a secure by default experience and easily use our platform. And one of those tools that we've worked on is K-Rail. And with our platform, engineers typically have access to the Kubernetes clusters that they deploy on. And they usually have a controlled namespace that they can work in. But as you may be aware, there are a lot of features in the Kubernetes API that can make multi-tenancy difficult and not the most secure, even if you apply role-based access control and other best practices. K-Rail, we started, there were some of the alternatives that there are now, but some of our criteria led us to the design that we have today that we think has some advantages over some of the alternatives today still. And one of those choices was having it completely implemented in Go, including the policies. And that gives a lot of flexibility to define policies. We have the full power of Go on our side, and we can do whatever we need to do from there. And some examples of that are some policies that are a work in progress that actually talk to the Kubernetes API as well. So we recently added a pod exec policy, which prevents people from execing into pods. And some things that we might do there is like adding a taint label to a pod when it's been execed into, and then cleaning up that pod some period after their session is over. And that requires interacting with a Kubernetes API and is not something that's easy to do and sometimes impossible with some of the alternatives today. Another thing that we are working on right now is loads by using separate node pools. And to do that, we're basically evaluating their compliance with existing policies and some other criteria. And we can automatically change their workload to schedule them elsewhere. I can give you a quick demo if I can share my screen in this web browser of some of the features that we currently have. And I just ran from an interview, so I'm not really all set up here.
No worries.
Yeah. Can you see my screen now?
Yep.
I think so, yeah.
Okay. So I have just a plain old GKE cluster that I'm authenticated to right now. And this is one I've actually been testing, our internal deployment method, which uses an open source tool called Isopod. So I believe I already have an installation on here. I wonder if it's going to conflict with the open source deployment. We'll see. So the installation instructions give a simple way to install KREL onto a cluster. We advocate using Helm template, and we just pipe it to kubectl. And we can see if our pods are running. It looks like they're starting up and rotating out the deployment now. Each time you apply it, it actually redeploys all of them because it rotates the certificate authority and the key that's used. And so that changes the deployment spec as well as mutating webhook configuration. So they need to be all cycled out. That's a trait of just the Helm deployment though. So it looks like they're all started now. I have a few non-compliant, that's the wrong one, non-compliant deployment examples that can be used to test the default policies that are enabled. And you can see that in the output when we run that. There are a few bind mounts which are forbidden by policy. Docker sock mount is one of them, and a few other policies there. We can also try to exec into one if I start a pod. I think this one will work. Oh, it's already running. Oh, sleep. Oh, I gotta delete this pod and try starting it again. Okay, now let's try to exec. So execs are forbidden. As I mentioned, we have some features that are in progress that work with the Kubernetes API to improve this. So if there was an exemption in place for execing into pods, KREL would have automatically added an annotation to the pod saying that it's now tainted, somebody has execed into it. And then you have KREL remove that pod at a later time without causing disruptions. And the reasoning behind that is that pod is now not trusted. Somebody may have tampered with it. And as a result, it'll remove it and replace it with a fresh one. And we'll also have an audit log that somebody has tampered with it. One of the really powerful features of KREL are the exemptions I just mentioned. And they are what has enabled us to rapidly roll out enforcement to some large existing clusters that we have that have thousands of diverse workloads on them. It's just an easy to understand YAML format. It's a list of exemptions, and you can do it by resource name, namespace, username, group, and the policies that you want to allow. The configuration is just in a config map, which we thought was a nice simple way to do it, rather than a bunch of CRDs for each one. And the exemptions and the policy configurations are all within the Helm values.yaml file. So it's all in one easy place for people to configure it how they want. Another big feature that we've engineered into this is that people get real-time feedback of their violations as they apply their resource. And you saw that with the non-compliant deployment. And what's different about this from some other solutions is that many of them only check for pods. And so what would happen is your deployment might apply successfully. And then that deployment controller will spin up a replica set. But when the replica set controller tries to create the pod, that's when it gets rejection and it fails. And for a user, that's not a very clear experience. And many of our users aren't even aware of those layers of abstraction. They just expect their pods to be running. And the only way to really see it at that point is to look at the logs of your tool, or to look at events, or to inspect the replica set. So this was a very important feature for us, and we support over 15 high-level resources in Kubernetes to provide this real-time feedback. That's just for pods. We also support other resources as well. It's still a pretty early project though, so there's a ton of room for improvement, and we have a lot of really cool stuff in progress that we're going to release open source soon. That's about all I've got for you. Is there anything else that you guys would like to see while my screen shared?
Well, I guess maybe I'm just kind of halfway jumping into the QA section of this. You define the policies in code, and then you do a kind of GitOps sort of thing?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Have you ever gotten to a like chicken egg problem where your policies were preventing you from deploying your policies? Or
no, so the default open source deployment method, which is Helm, the mutating webhook configuration actually will omit the KREL namespace by default. So nothing in that namespace is enforced. And with our setup, we use role-based engineers a namespace for their project. So they wouldn't have access to that. It's only cluster admins. And that's a pretty common pattern among tools that use webhooks in general. Like OPA does the same thing to prevent you from basically not being able to make changes.
one thing that's super cool from this is it's really nice to see like it coming from a user who's using this for something that they depend on, and like is coming from that like the real needs, since a lot of times when it's too much coming from the provider side, including myself, it's kind of floating in theory land. So it's really interesting and great to see something coming from the needs of what you're using right now. It's interesting, like mentioned you chose Go when it's flexible, and then Go in particular because of like client Go and its support with working with Kubernetes. If there were better like client library support or some other kind of mechanism, do you think you would have still gone with Go?
Yeah, I think we would have. Our security engineers are for the most part also software engineers, and many of us are comfortable with Go. For me, it's almost like a second language, and it's my favorite programming language to write in. And we found that with the right abstractions, it's really easy to add new policies, and we get that flexibility, and we're comfortable with the language. We know that's not true for everyone, though. So I think there's definitely room for other solutions that use various DSLs or custom resources. But for us, this is definitely a way to go. And over time, we see more and more use cases, fancier features that we want to add that require some of that flexibility. And that design choice has enabled us to implement them pretty easily.
When did you open source it? How long has it been?
It's just been a few weeks now. Yeah, we open sourced it, I think mid to late October during a conference.
You mentioned like node pools. Do you have kind of, this is something I think is so missing from Kubernetes. So I would just be curious to get more or I just want more validation on this, of grouping nodes, kind of not namespaced, but basically namespaced. And you're doing a lot of policy enforcement based on groupings like that? Are you just using labels and whatever else to do that?
Oh, so I think node pool is a terminology specific to GKE, but under the hood basically uses taints and tolerations on nodes. And basically the feature that we're working on now will have some criteria. And basically if a workflow doesn't meet that criteria, we put it in this kind of quarantine zone of servers. So all the ones that are following the best practices, they get to run together in a nice, clean environment. And the ones that are kind of a work in progress or in bad shape, they're separated. And that's really helpful when we're running very large multi-tenant clusters here.
Another sort of practical question. You print out, was it the violations in the config map or the results? Was that what you were using that config map for?
I'm not sure what you're referring to specifically.
Might have missed exactly.
So there's a config map for the policy configuration and KREL configuration. But the Helm deployment has combined both of those, well, everything just into the values.yaml. So the Helm deployment will pull those out and insert them into config maps.
So you're using config maps for config. That makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, some people might reach for CRDs, but we thought that was a nice, simple way to do it.
Has it sometimes like config maps are easier at first, and then you realize like CRDs can be better because you can like RBAC them separately, or the schemas are useful. Sometimes you make a CRD and it's like, well, we don't actually know what our data was. We could have just used a config map. Have you found that you wish you had used one or the other in a different place?
So far, not yet, especially since we provide like a fully featured default configuration. It makes it easy for people to modify and deploy. But where I could see them being beneficial is when you want to make breaking changes. CRDs can easily be versioned, and you can easily implement some more backwards compatibility that way. So one thing I didn't mention during the quick demo before, the output of all the violations, whether they're exempt or not, and other operations that KREL does, is in structured JSON in the logs. And we cover this in the blog that I linked in the Kubernetes channel. But we were able to use that data to load it into BigQuery and make some nice dashboards for engineers to look at. So that data is open. And what we found during rollout, when we were just in the collecting data stage, is that when we made that available to engineers, they started remediating their own issues. And a lot of issues got closed out just like that, just by giving them the information. And we thought that was really powerful. So we definitely advocate people to do that if they're implementing this. And I could also see maybe some future where some contribution makes those dashboards just a native feature in KREL to enable organizations that maybe don't have that tooling or don't have the resources to set it up. But if you're in GKE and you follow that blog post, you can adopt that pattern.
Did you, I guess they're kind of more events rather than metrics, because one way that is supported, since Kubernetes doesn't like have, there's I guess some structured different logging things, but like Prometheus endpoints and scraping and presenting the data that way. Did you consider that? Or something like that?
Yeah, so webhooks by default give you some metrics on the Kubernetes API. We do make use of those, and we have Prometheus scrape them. And I know there's a way to add custom metrics, but I haven't looked into it too much at this point. But that seems like it could be a valuable addition for anybody that's scraping those.
What do you wish was Kubernetes could do or change that would make this project better for you or improve your life based on your?
Well, there was one issue that we encountered that I think has been remediated in 1.14. And that is basically if your webhook times out, then controllers will time out. There wasn't any way to fix that prior to that version. So that was pretty problematic, but we still ran with the solution even in production because we run with a pod disruption budget and we run internal to the cluster, and we really haven't had any reliability issues. But that's something that we encountered during development and just from a misconfiguration. And we realized that that's a major operational concern. So when Kubernetes adds like these webhook features that affect emission of resources, it's really important for those kind of aspects to be taken into account because they can really affect cluster reliability. Just having a webhook timeout would cause replica set controllers to time out doing any operations against the API, if I recall correctly, and it caused a lot of weird issues in the cluster. That's since been fixed though on newer versions, but definitely important considerations when engineering that kind of stuff. Other than that, it would be nice if there was a way to provide similar functionality in a more robust way, like having pluggable admission controllers across cloud platforms. One of my gripes with GKE is that they really don't give you much control over how the kubelet is run, what's enabled, what's not enabled. But it would be nice if there's maybe load in some plugins that use RPC or something like that to provide a more robust mechanism that's not communicating over the cluster network potentially. In a way I've seen that implemented is HashiCorp has a Go plugin package, and they use that for plugins in Bolt and a few other products. That might provide a nice alternate interface for adding this sort of functionality and potentially be a bit more robust. And it can also give you some nice type safety as well.
It's interesting. You mentioned not over the cluster network. Some sense I see like a consolidation of putting everything into the cluster and over, the cluster, bootstrapping a cluster, bootstrapping a cluster. But on the other hand, there's sort of a more old school, like fundamental separation of these planes. How do you see that changing, or do you think that it's increasingly important to have more separable mechanism?
I think both is definitely a good thing to have, like both options. I can see the concerns on either side. When I mentioned RPC through Go plugin, that would probably end up being RPC over a loopback interface on a master. But then that brings its own concerns. Like you would be running plugins on a master node, which could potentially bring instability. If there is a memory leak or something, it could affect the functionality of that. So there would definitely need to be some safeguards in place. And the way that some companies like GKE provide managed master nodes, it might not be a good solution for them. They might not want customers running their own code in that environment.
Someone could correct me, but like that's sort of how they did some of like the container runtime interface and other CNI. Those interfaces use a similar kind of model, right, of an RPC interface over the local network. Anyone know?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Oh, I've been asking too many questions, so please someone else do.
I was curious about what your roadmap is looking like and what are you looking at tackling next?
For KRail?
Yep.
So as it is right now, we've rolled out to all environments in Cruise. So engineering, staging, and production across many clusters, some very large ones with existing workloads. So it's in a running production state here. But we are adding policies over time and enhancements to existing ones that provide more security policies, but also a few operational policies as well that helps the stability and reliability. One of them that we added recently is a mutating policy to add a safe to evict annotation, which facilitates the Kubernetes cluster autoscaler and allows it to evict workloads that it could not before without user intervention. So we're working closely with our platform team to try to cover some of their operational concerns, as well as push our security concerns. And we have a few, I mentioned a few of the policies that we have in progress, like running high-risk workloads on their own servers and that kind of thing. So we're working with our platform team to rally them behind the idea, and they've been really supportive. But we'll be adding books and cool things like that in the future that can provide some real impact. But other than that, I don't think there's a whole lot more to the roadmap at the moment, just continuous improvement, adding more capabilities. We can't dedicate our time fully to this tool. We have other responsibilities and lots of other cool projects in progress as well. Some will be open source eventually.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, so what are the major tasks that are running inside the Cruise Kubernetes cluster? Is it like machine learning jobs for the autonomous driving, or?
It's a wide range of things, and depending on which cluster you look at too. There are certainly some very large data processing workloads, machine learning workloads. We have a lot of like pipeline jobs that do various data tasks as well. There are internal like web services and then external services. There are services that interact with the cars. Well, the cars connect to them. It's a one-way thing. Yeah, just pretty much everything under the sun that you could imagine to run a business and to also run the product and develop the product.
Interesting. So for multi-tenancy is like mainly used for interdepartmental isolation, or like between different teams.
We do isolation between our tenants.
Yeah, I mean,
Or
so you emphasize on the multi-tenancy, right? So is it mainly for the isolation between like departments, or just soft isolation between teams?
oh, okay. So we actually have some other blog posts on Medium from some of our platform people that cover some of these topics and how we've engineered it. But for the most part, we have namespace per project, and a project could even be a cross-team project, and its members will be the people that are working on that project. And we have different tiers of permissions, like there's editor, admin, and read-only. And those permissions also sync across other parts of infrastructure we use, like Vault for secrets and some other things that Vault does. But basically, we leverage role-based access control in Kubernetes to provide that namespace isolation per project. And we have another open source tool called RBAC Sync, which syncs Google Groups to Kubernetes RBAC, which syncs the members of those projects to give them the appropriate level of access to their namespace.
Cool. I noticed KREL like was generated from the OSS template. Can you talk about the?
Oh, that's just a small repo that has some of the boilerplate that
Okay.
crews require for open source repos. There's not a whole lot there. You can feel free to check it out though.
Okay. I have no
Yeah,
further
there's
questions.
no code generation or anything like that.
Okay.
Just to follow up on the RBAC parts you were talking about, because we were talking about this earlier on a SIG security call, and I put it on the agenda for today. Sounds like you guys have a lot of operational experience in trying to manage RBAC. Has that been painful for you? Is it? I mean, do you have like thousands of roles, or is it just like a handful? And how does that interact with both KRail and just in general?
So there was definitely a learning curve, and I did not engineer all of that. But at a high level, we defined like a few basic roles like namespace editor, namespace admin, namespace viewer, and RBAC Sync assigns people to those roles based on the Google group membership that they have. We also have some onboarding automation that will basically bootstrap a project and all those dependent resources and give project owners a way to manage membership that syncs to the other systems. So like that would bootstrap them a GCP project with the correct access controls, Terraform enterprise workspace, a Kubernetes namespace, Vault namespace, and Vault authentication roles for other systems like Terraform within Vault as well. So it just bootstraps all of that to get them started quickly and have the correct access control configuration. But yeah, I highly recommend checking out the RBAC Sync blog post and project if you're interested in more about how we do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Will do.
And KRail doesn't really do any interaction with RBAC right now, although for some of the Kubernetes API features that I'm adding, it's going to have a cluster role binding in a service account, so it can do those things.
Meaning like just RBACing on the project itself, or using the RBAC like roles and cluster roles as part of the policy making decisions?
It'll just use those resources so that it can interact with the Kubernetes API. But we do grab username and group information that we use for the exemptions. So
how do you grab that information?
It's part of the admission review request that comes into KRail. But with the way that we have RBAC set up, like RBAC Sync will sync a user from a Google group into Kubernetes. And so the admission review object will show their corporate email as the username that's applying that resource. Or potentially a service account or a group or something. So it ties well to like how we reference people elsewhere.
Got it. Having done Google Group syncs once upon a time, sometimes that API can be difficult to work with, but definitely is a good, consistent experience for the users.
I think I saw recently that GKE is actually rolling out some sort of RBAC sync like feature as well. I have not looked into that much yet because we already have mature solution implemented.
How many users do you typically have in a cluster?
I don't have a great number for that, but we do have hundreds of engineers in many projects. One of our biggest clusters at any given time will have about 18,000 pods on it across about 70 namespaces. And that number fluctuates a lot. There are a lot of ephemeral workloads, like from pipeline jobs and machine learning jobs and stuff like that. So they definitely see a bit of traffic.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any other questions? This was really great to hear and learn about.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great project. The only other question I had is, did you have some sort of roadmap for how you wanted to kind of expand the open source participation, or is that just this is part of it and you just throw it out there and see if anyone kind of jumps in? Or...
Yeah, I mean, so far it pretty much has been throwing it out there and sharing our experience and hoping that some people try it out, give us some feedback. We've had a few contributions so far that we're thankful for, and good bug report too. We definitely welcome contributions, and we'll probably look at adding a roadmap of like some of the work that we'd love to get from the community going forward. Thanks again for inviting me here to share a little bit about this. I guess I have a few questions for you though. Prior to reaching out, I didn't really know about the policy working group and what you're all are about. And I guess I'm still learning some of that. So I'm curious, like, what your end goals are for this.
Anybody want to start?
Never like starting.
I'll take a stab at it. I mean, first and foremost, it's a volunteer effort, so it's kind of a there's no formal agenda per se, other than as kind of an offshoot of the CNCF SIG security group, which has kind of a larger following. This is kind of a breakout focus specifically on policy. I think that the topics that have been of interest, I think, overlap a lot of what you've talked about in terms of how do you bootstrap policy, how do you enforce it, what are all the various options out there. So I think we're kind of in just the cataloging phase of you've got things like Falco and OPA and others, and just trying to learn what the practical best practices are and what people are using. And then we've just started dipping our toes into like, are there abstractions that might be useful across all these implementations that might be an option for standardization, or at least patterns. So for example, we've discussed the notion very recently of is there kind of an output format that would be useful? Because to your earlier point, once you get the data surfaced and make it available to operators, engineers, DevOps folks, they can then fix issues. They can be more responsive, more proactive. So if all implementations could kind of homogenize on some output, maybe that's useful. So those are the kind of discussions I think we've been having recently. I'm definitely interested in cataloging and gathering, real scale use cases as folks are hitting either issues with performance or manageability, and trying to catalog approaches for managing things at scale. As a lot of folks are kind of playing around and then transitioning to production, and it sounds like you're way ahead of that curve, because it sounds like you've been doing in production for some time. Definitely trying to understand more of those real world use cases, I think, will benefit the community. But I'll shut up.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we also discuss of some niche research area like formal verification. So typically, financial sector is a big like customer for the formal verification. I think autonomous driving might be another, set of customers that might be interested looking at the formal application of Kubernetes policies as a like future research.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, shall we follow along the agenda? What else on the items we want to discuss?
Well, that next item was mine, and I think I think we just had a great conversation about RBAC. So I brought this up on the SIG security call earlier today. I think Christian is on, who also had an interest as well, or some experience with this. But the notion of how manageable RBAC is, it's an open call to anyone who has any good resources on kind of case studies, real world examples of managing RBAC at scale, and any of the issues or things that are working, things that are not working so well. I'd love to get that information and kind of consolidate and slice and dice it, and then represent it back from things that I learned. And of course, that has some practical applications for things I'm working on, but I think the larger community might benefit as well. I guess I'll just throw that out there. And, are there other projects that anyone on this call is aware of that might have published Medium posts or other resources on their experiences with RBAC?
I'm sure I could dig some up, and I can talk a tiny bit about the OpenShift side, as probably, I think OpenShift kind of brought RBAC into Kubernetes a while ago, so we're responsible for the best and worst of a lot of it. And I can say, just even managing the policies, there are the RBAC that we ship with OpenShift, it can be very annoying to deal with in certain ways. Most of the time, if someone has to change it or touch it, it's probably not going to be a good day. But once you kind of have set it, and if it's like a good default that you have, usually then it seems like it's a very good guardrail that we rely upon a lot.
So one of the kind of use cases, or I guess problem areas that came up earlier, not specific to Kubernetes RBAC, but Mark on the security was saying, a common scenario that he's seen in the real world is, you've got two companies, they're operating at scale, and they're going to merge, right? So I guess starting to think that way as more and more folks deploy prod Kubernetes. Like if you've got 10,000 users in two different orgs, and then now you've got to go, figure out how to merge those, or if you're spinning off a division, how are you going to make sure that you're not leaving dangling roles and bindings and whatnot? So those are the kind of real world cases that get kind of thorny.
Yeah, I was wondering, maybe there was a mention about like you have automatic onboarding. What about offboarding?
I think
for
especially the
users in RBAC?
offboarding was a question that Mark had. So RBAC policies, or policies in general, tend to grow, right? Pruning them back is always involved some risk, and so they are looking at doing some ML studies, how they can figure out to automatically drop certain people from policies.
Well, as far as offboarding goes, RBAC sync is it's a two-way sync. So if they get removed from the Google group and from the G Suite organization, they get removed from the Kubernetes access as well.
Does that handle any kind of cascading permissions? So if someone creates a service account, even if you delete that user, that service account potentially has just as much permissions. Maybe that's.
So you're saying they created a resource, but then they leave. The concern is whether or not it's cleaned up.
If you create a service account that has as much permission as you do, even if you leave, if you have access to that service account, you can launch pods or create more resources with the same level.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess some of that comes down to how you authenticate to Kubernetes. And there are various ways with pros and cons, but the GKE default uses OAuth 2 credentials through Google. And so they're fairly short-lived, and they're controlled by the membership to that organization. And that's the only authentication method that we have enabled on the cluster. So in addition to that, of course, it's on a private network as well. So they get offboarded from the VPN and other processes as well. So they should lose their access when they leave the company. But Kubernetes doesn't clean up resources that were created by an entity that no longer exists, which is probably desirable.
Yeah, it can be just as horrible if you take away someone's access and something breaks.
Yep.
Is OpenShift leveraging any of the OpenStack RBAC stuff?
Not really, or at least the onus would be on the OpenStack, people working on OpenStack, on OpenShift on whatever, whichever way that is, to utilize it. Rather, and there's, I think that some of the other, there's a lot identity management products and solutions kind of have integrations both ways, but it's not as tied that closely.
Okay.
No.
Like, are we interested? Maybe invite some of the OpenStack RBAC folks come over, give a talk, maybe.
I'm always interested in learning from and hearing from other sides and perspectives, especially other projects.
Yeah. So it's also mass here in OpenStack, so maybe we just can exchange SaaS stories. Okay, so follow up on the RPI standardization discussion. Any like anything concrete follow up moves we should do? I see Falco failed the incubation application.
I didn't hear that.
Yeah, they finished the due diligence and officially applied for the incubation. So like any activities afterwards from the Falco side on the RPI, or it's sort of sitting still?
I don't think we have any. I don't think we have Michael or folks on.
Yeah.
So I was hoping that someone might join, but we'll have to reach out and probably, I guess, schedule specifically with them if they want to do represent RPI or present on new progress. But I think I know last session there was someone who volunteered to write up kind of their version of what a standardized result might look like. Or maybe I'm remembering that incorrectly. But I thought someone had volunteered. I was just hoping if they would give an update.
Yeah, I thought that someone did, yeah.
Really? Last time? From the Kyverno team? Or?
Yeah, I think it might have been from Kyverno, but I'm forgetting the name.
Okay. Maybe I can ping them. Okay, for KubeCon, well, my visa is still on check, so my highly possibly I will not make to the KubeCon. So JJ tasked me with SIG security deep dive, like co-presentation. I think I will still be working on the slides, but if I can make it, maybe I need to either like task Erica or Robert.
Robert, were you able to confirm if you're gonna make it?
No, unfortunately, I was able to confirm that I won't be able to make it. I've got some unavoidable conflicts. I have some flexibility to present or participate remotely, but I can't commit to being there on site.
For the entire event?
No, I have some flexibility Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, but I have some meetings in Denver Tuesday and then all day Wednesday.
Okay, let me check the date for the deep dive and yeah, let's see. And I think we have another event is the Contributor Summit. Meet with the SIG and working groups. And yeah, Erica, you need to
That's on Monday, right?
be there and wooing developers coming over.
Wooing. Let's see. Policy. Yeah, policy is usually not a cool topic. I guess we could find some ways to rebrand.
Yeah. Okay. Any other topics or items?
So no, following up on the standardization, maybe should we just wait for next week? It's hard to assume something can get done in a week's
Yeah, I
time.
think so. Next week, it's it's still before QCon, right? The
Yes.
12th. Okay. Yeah, we can. Yeah, we can do that next week. Oh, 12. Let me think. 13. Yes, I can do that. Cool.
Yeah, it'd be great to get an update if we can from Bruno, and if not, we can reach out. Maybe I'll try to do some research around what all the other kind of policy result formats are, and then also various logging options and audit logs and whatnot. So get some basic patterns, and I'll write up the stuff that I've collected.
That'd be great.
I'd love to. I'm trying to find out from Mark on his machine learning stuff. I think that's an interesting complementary thread to the formal verification. I think it's looking at the elephant from two different views. So I think that could be an interesting next step on the Guardian discussion.
Yeah, or especially I think since they're so opposite, that's why they might like together work so well, if that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, right, like there's usually the expert opinion plus the machine learning, or put together is the best rather than one or the other. I remember like seeing, because there's a lot of fun stuff you can do with like the BPF and on the fly adjustable policies. That would definitely be more hip and get us some more attention, I think.
Yeah, we just had our buzzword, machine learning.
Can we get some IoT? What else do we need?
Yeah, serverless.
Blockchain.
Blockchain.
I don't know. I feel like blockchain might be on the way out, right? Am I wrong?
No, it's in again. There's a huge I don't
Depends
know.
what Bitcoin is trading at on a given day.
Yeah, they need policy as well. Okay, thank you guys. So let's conclude for today, and I will upload the recording as usual.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.